Hello everyone and welcome to this latest video discussion as part of the RICS Tech Partner Programme. My name is Andrew Knight and I've been with RICS for over 13 years now. I sit within our thought leadership and analytics part of the organisation, and my role is to look at the impact of AI, data and technology right across the built and natural environment. And with over 130,000 members worldwide, working right across that full land and property life cycle, all the way from land through planning and development, construction, brokerage, valuation, finance, building operation, portfolio management, property management. Is a very rich canvas upon which data and tech's having a very, very large and profound effect. And indeed, our members work right across all the different asset types, land itself, residential, commercial in all its forms, and infrastructure. So once again, a very broad spectrum that our members get involved in. And today I'm really happy to have Martin join me from Geosmart in a second of a series of conversations we've had with Geosmart. And I guess before we get into the bits and bytes and the kind of areas of expertise that you're bringing to the marketplace, Martin, it'd be great to have a bit of a backstory about you and just a very brief introduction to Geosmart.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you for inviting me to come and talk with you and everyone else today. So yes, my name is Martin Lucas. I'm a director of a business called Geosmart. Geosmart itself is a specialist in understanding flood risk and flood risk data in the UK is kind of where we're sat. But myself, I started life as a geologist at Leeds University. Very quickly found an interest specifically centered around water. So I trained as a hydrogeologist. Hydrogeologist's job is basically to make sure that when we turn the taps on, it's clean drinking water that comes out. But then over the years, this thing called flooding certainly sort of started to rear its head more and more. And as a hydrogeologist, as a specialist in groundwater, how groundwater interacts with water and rivers is a really key part of the story of flooding. So that's where I've sort of found myself here talking today about flooding in the UK.
Brilliant, brilliant. Well, I suppose for those listening and living in the UK, it's hard to ignore the fact that I think we've had, what is it, the wettest 150, the wettest, I think 18 months in 150 years. It's been an incredibly sort of wet winter. We've seen, recent floods again across the UK and the news, in the news headlines. I mean, is this the new normal when we look at the sort of level of flood risk to residential property? Is this a world we're now living with?
Yeah, it definitely does seem to be that way. You're absolutely correct there. The Met Office published some information saying it was the last 18 months had been the wettest on the record. Obviously, we've seen some global events happening recently as well, such as in Dubai, where they had some significant flooding. And I wonder, how well are their buildings and residential property set up for flooding? I suspect they probably don't consider it. But that's the situation we find ourselves in the UK as well, is we've got a huge housing stock of properties built in areas which are susceptible to flooding, which the buildings are just not prepared for flooding. In a sort of a more global sense, climate change, we'd be looking at perils. There would be things like tornado, hurricane, wildfire, heat and flood. And obviously in the UK, maybe you could say we're fortunate to only really experience flooding as one of the effects of climate change. But yes, we seem to have moved from a situation where we were experiencing some sort of national flood event maybe every 5 years or 10 years to something that's happening every single year, or perhaps more often than that. You mentioned the last 18 months. We've had about 10 or so named storms. And if you're living in any of the areas such as Lincolnshire or Nottinghamshire, Gloucestershire or Bath, there's been some really very significant flooding in the last this storm season, basically since August of last year. So yes, unfortunately, I think this is probably the new normal, and it's projected to get from here out as well.
So Martin, I mean, obviously, and I would probably fall into this trap myself, that you jump to the initial conclusion that flood risk is all around homes close to the coast, near to rivers. But given this change, are we in danger of misunderstanding the current level of flood risk, given this sort of changing new normal that we're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very reasonable view and something that's been quite relevant for a long period of time. But with these changes in climate change relating to rainfall in particular, we're also seeing now these very high intensity rainfall events where there's a significant amount of water coming down in a very short period of time, which, as well as the river and coastal flooding, gives us these surface water flood events. So, I mean, up here in Manchester, we had the Primark puddle, which was a significant body of water that was sat outside the Primark in the town centre here, which isn't something that's happened before, but it's a result of there just being so much rainfall in such a short period of time that even our Victorian drainage systems, which are designed to take it out to the river as fast as possible, actually even can't cope with that level of water. So, as well as the historical sort of river and coastal flooding, we do see these surface water flood events now as well. And on top of that, with this very wet winter we've had, for instance, we're also seeing more of an impact from groundwater flooding. So groundwater is a sort of a long-term event where water levels within the soil rise up and emerge at surface, and they can stick around for 3 months, 4 months, or even longer. And we've definitely seen some things in the news from farmers saying that they can't get crops in the field, or that some of their crops are failing because they're basically just completely waterlogged. Um, so yeah, there's a greater spread of risks and flood-related risks we should be looking at the moment.
Indeed, and from a kind of a planning and development perspective, what about addressing these risks in terms of new build? Are you seeing those participants in the market now thinking differently and reacting differently when there's these new variations on a theme, dare I say, of flooding are emerging now?
Yeah, so I mean, planning is basically our best opportunity to really get a control on what we're going to be building now and into the future. So certainly the idea of building residential properties on flood zones, is gone now. We do obviously have an existing housing stock that we need to work to address. But we've got well-defined flood zones. Obviously, at GeoSmart as well, we create and look at flood data to see which residential properties aren't affected by the different types of flooding. And in London, this is quite important information as well. So it's obviously very difficult to build up in London. So we end up, seeing a lot of basements going in as well. And there's quite strict controls there on the level of information that's required to submit for a planning application. So consultants like ourselves and structural engineers will really need to look at base flow of water, even water in London that's perched on impermeable London clay, which could be sort of just moving horizontally into a basement, are things that will get looked at and addressed, and we need to mitigate against. So the idea being really that in new builds, anything that does go up is protected from flooding. And as part of those assessments, we basically imagine ourselves into the future. So we look at the amount of rain that could fall in a 1 in 100 year rainfall event. So there's a 1% chance it might happen that year. And then we add on a load of extra water into that rainfall event for climate change adjustments. So hopefully we are designing buildings now which will still be suitable in 50 or 100 years time, and we won't find that they're actually not designed appropriately. So that's a really important thing. I mean, on the existing properties as well, those coastal properties, what we actually see at the moment is probably about one residential property a year which is being lost to coastal retreat. It's not a huge number, obviously significant impact for the people that have that property, but that number is expected to go up as well. And so what we have are shoreline management plans, where basically we've decided which parts of the shoreline we'll defend and protect, and then other parts of the shoreline which will basically be in a managed retreat. And that has a knock-on effect for planning for new builds as well, because if that part of the coastline is in a managed retreat, that effectively means that whilst that area isn't at risk of flooding now, at some point in the future it will be. So there's additional restrictions on what can actually be done or built in those areas.
Indeed. I mean, you touched on sort of, existing properties there, and as you say, some kind of almost managed situations where they will unfortunately fall victim to that coastal piece particularly. But for existing older properties, I mean, what's the level of effectiveness that you see for flood defences and mitigation solutions? Because clearly the majority of the stock is already built, is already where it is. How well are we being able to protect those from all these both existing and new forms of flooding?
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty important thing. Like you said, a lot of our housing stock is already here. Certainly, I would say for the older buildings are much more difficult to retrofit and make suitable. Things that are built more recently in the last sort of couple of decades, not such an issue. But there are a number of things. With older buildings, we don't tend to have a waterproof slab, for instance, installed as part of the foundation design. So that could cause some issues, whereas the modern properties are generally a bit easier to work with. But there are things that can be done. A key thing, I mentioned this before, but there are 4 main types of flooding, which are river flooding, coastal flooding, tidal flooding, surface water flooding, and groundwater flooding. And with properties, it's important to understand which of those types of flooding it is that's affecting the property. Because if it's a groundwater flood, you could have water coming up into a basement structure, or literally up through the floorboards of the building. Whereas if it's a surface water flood, it tends to be water that's being channeled in one direction towards a property. So perhaps you could create some way of diverting that away from your property. Whereas with groundwater flooding, you need to think about stopping the water from actually coming up in the first place, which is potentially a little bit more tricky to do. But I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that we can do. Things like non-return valves on air bricks. So as the water level rises, the valves close. That stops water from getting in. That's quite a popular thing that we see. Or active measures where someone will come and physically install barriers across doors during times of flood. That can help keep the water out of properties as well. They're never completely watertight, as you can imagine, but those are the sorts of things that we can look at and advise on and help people with, where properties are still ultimately going to be flooded because there's nothing we can do to completely protect them. Then there's still things such as changing the floors into a tile floor rather than carpeted floors or wood floors. Or we can do things like raise the electrical goods, white goods, raise the plug sockets, so that when that property is flooded, the amount of damages and the amount of time it takes to clean it up afterwards is significantly reduced.
Indeed. And obviously, we've talked about these kind of 4 fundamental flooding risk issues. I mean, how does that lead to the kind of regional footprint of risk in the UK? So if you stand back and almost take a satellite view of the UK, what does it look like in terms of that light and shade in terms of risk for flood generally across the UK now?